Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. I hope you've had fruitful discussion so far. I would like to welcome you to this conversation on the European Union and Africa in a new global order. My name is Sandra Tombe, and I'm a visiting scholar at George Mason University. I'm very pleased to be joined by such an esteemed panel. I would like to just kind of set the stage by highlighting why it's important to have this conversation at this particular moment. Of course, you're familiar that this is the 30th anniversary of Africa Day, and it's a testament to how much Africa has contributed to the Netherlands and to Europe, and contributes to the continent by the communities that have made this place their home. Secondly, and more importantly, we're all witnesses to an increasingly multipolar world as the global order kind of shifts, centers of power ebbing and flowing, and multiplying, right? So Africa and the EU must think about what the relationship to one another looks like, and what is it that they take forward in this kind of new global order, and what their partnership looks like more specifically. While we understand that Africa and the EU have different political interests that could be aided by collaboration, we also understand that there are asymmetries between how Africa and the EU engage with one another, and those are due to historical reasons that we're all familiar with, or at least I lost my on. Okay, it's back on. All right. And those asymmetries are to a great extent currently institutionalized in how these states function. For one, for example, we could think about the perception of the EU normative stance towards Africa and other places. We could think about how that's channelized through regulations like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, along with the persistence of extractive approaches to how Europe oftentimes engages with Africa. And all of those continue to complicate equal partnership between Africa and Europe. On the Africa side, on the other hand, we see that there are governance challenges and that there's limited state capacities that make it really difficult for African states to deliver for their citizens. And those are challenges that exist even when we know that there's financial resources that are oftentimes being mismanaged. Second, and that's come clear in the panel I was just attending previous to this one, which is that Africa and the EU believe in multilateralism. I hope that my panelists and everyone here would agree that the EU and the African Union are both experiments that are worth continuing to explore, despite the challenges that we face with them, despite how disappointing they can be sometimes, but those are institutions that are worth investing in. With all of those layers on the table, I would like for my panelists to help us think about some of these larger questions. So I've mentioned some normative differences between the EU and Africa, interest in economic development for Africa, lacks of state capacity on the continent, and then individual European states, but also these multilateral institutions in the bodies of the EU and the African Union. I'm interested for the panel to help us think about how can both continents move beyond inherited and existing asymmetries to conduct partnerships that are anchored in trust, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, and a commitment to a more sustainable development going forward. I am joined by a very esteemed panel. They have quite a deep resume, and I will not be able to get into that because of time. I would like for us to have a conversation, but also for you to be able to ask questions and to engage with the panel. So we'll focus most of our time for that, but I'll happily mention their names and their affiliation very briefly, and then we can get into some of our questions. So I am joined by Bert Koenders, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands and the current president of FMS. And then Joel Netshitenzi, who is the Executive Director of Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. And then Ann Linde, who is the former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden and a FEB Special Advisor. And then last but not least, Christopher Mogudede. I'm from South Sudan, so this should have been easy for me as an African, so please forgive me. He is the editor of World Politics Review and a foreign affairs analyst. I would like for us to kind of start with a question that helps set the stage here as to why is it important to have this conversation about EU-Africa relations. So maybe I'll start with Lind to kind of help us get a perspective from the point of view of Europe. Why should Europe partner with Africa, and why is that important?
Well, I would say that the most simple answer is that because our future are bound together. EU or Europe, forgive me, UK, are not separate realities. We have to actually face the same storms that are coming. If it's climate, digital transformation, disruption, security threats, inequality. But too often, Europe has approached Africa in a sense of Africa is needing help, or there is a problem. And I was a cabinet minister for nearly 7 years, Minister of Trade, EU Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and I think I can count one hand when we have, during those 40 ministerial I took part in, that we discussed Africa. I know they did it in the development aid ministers a lot, but still, I mean, it was not a subject that was on the table, on the agenda for the EU foreign minister or a trade minister if it wasn't, like I said, for these seasons. I mean, Africa holds an enormous potential, and it's not only for the critical raw materials that everybody is talking about now, but also it has a young workforce, it has a leaping green transition that is going on in many countries. It has innovations and also opportunities when it comes to digitalization. It's very different in different African countries. I have to spell that out. But in some countries, they are really far up. So we should not see this cooperation as charity. We should see it as a mutual strategic interest for both Africa and Europe. Yet there is a lot of mistrust, both between governments and between organizations. We heard here in the panel before us about the double standards, that many people feel that there are double standards on how Europe is treating different conflicts in the world, different governments. And there is, I say that in Europe we talked about strategic autonomy a lot, but we keep Africa in a dependency. And Africa also needs to have a strategic autonomy, as Europe has. Otherwise, it's not possible. Then finally, I would also say that now, yesterday, now what is it today? 15? Oh, 2 days ago, it was the 10-year anniversary of the terrorist attacks in France. And that was very emotional. I guess all of you saw it. I was state secretary then, and it was a shock for governments all over Europe. And as today, we are witnessing in some African countries the Islamic terrorist that is coming closer and closer to take over. I'm thinking especially of Mali. You have now an Islamist rebels that is linked to Al-Qaeda. They have now, the last days, shut down more or less all the fuel possibility. They have burned fuel trucks, they have killed drivers, and Bamako is on the verge of a collapse. And first, now in 2012 or something, France were on the request of the Mali government helping to fight those Islamists. Then, as I guess you are an educated crowd, you know there was the military coup after military coup in Sahel, altogether more than 7. And all the Western governments, including Sweden, was kicked out. And instead Russia came in with their Wagner group, that is now called the Africa Corps. And now they are kind of also letting go. And there is a real risk that this Islamist terrorist, the GNIM, is taking over. And then you have other countries like Nigeria and Burkina Faso. And then it's not just an African problem, then it's also a European problem, and we need to cooperate together, because that is the real threat. You know it in Africa, we know it in Europe, and this is also something that we cannot do alone. We must do it together.
Your point about security being a mutual point of interest for Africa and EU, I think, is a critical point. Bert, I would like to turn that question over to you. What would you add to Lind from an EU perspective? Why is it important for the EU to partner with Africa, perhaps?
Especially in the security field or in...
However you'd like to take that question, actually, given your background.
I don't want to add anything to which I think is very intelligently already mentioned by Anne. Look, I do agree very much with the point of, are we really ready and able and willing to work together strategically or not? That's the big question. At the moment, we are not. Let's be very open about it. We were talking, I think, in one of the other fora, the cooperation between Europe and Africa has been successful in certain elements, but in many not. There is an enormous amount of... Yes, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. By we, are you referring to EU, or are you referring to the EU and Africa both together, not being ready?
Both together.
Both together.
Yes, yes. I won't go into the whole history. I think we don't have the time for it. The question is what we have to do right now. And I appreciate very much what is happening in terms of the possibilities, not of the reality. Europe is, of course, very much looking at an existential fight with the problems in Ukraine. It's not very much looking at Africa, although there is a summit, but it's not at the top of the agenda. In Africa, we see a completely different development with quite a variety of different countries that have links with Europe, but have a difficulty to make sure that the interests of Africa in terms of, if I may say so, getting rid of its extractive economic model is actually gaining ground on the other side. So I would say that there are a few things that we have to do. I look very much at the future now, because I think there is a strategic moment, but we can easily fail it. The strategic moment is that Europe feels more alone. It has a different transatlantic relationship. It will become 6% of the world population. It's still big and rich, but it's very clumsy at the moment because we have a lot of internal problems and politics and polarization. And at the same time, at the European level, we are trying to build this strategic autonomy, but often at the cost of others still. In Africa, I think you have actually similar transitions as the transitions that we go through, although from an unequal starting point, but at the same time also at a momentum in which we could work together much better if we want to. And I think there are around 3 transitions, if I may be very quickly. One is, and I won't go into it, but I think it's absolutely key because of the criticism, correctly so, by many African states. It's the whole challenge of job creation, migration. 1 of 4 people will be African on the labor market in 10 years to come, and our own problems and possibilities of AI. That's one framework where all of us go together and where we need each other, short-term, medium, and long-term. This is around the sensitive issue of migration. Maybe we can talk about it later, but I think it's part and parcel of one of the key elements which Europe puts forward as its priority, and it doesn't necessarily lead to, the reducing of trust. The second is around security. Again, unequal starting position, very different countries, a big variety in Africa and in Europe, but we all based or faced with an enormous lack of resilience of our societies. I see an enormous amount of conflictuous potential and reality in Africa. I cannot be optimistic about that part. Look at the whole Sahel part, the Horn of Africa, part of Central Africa. But there are also many parts where economies are flowing, the fragility is there, but also the possibilities. And in Europe, you see similar. Let's start by prioritizing this as something which we are faced with together. I do not want to mention it today, but I think we should. And I'm saying that to our European partners, including my own government. If we are not even today able to prioritize the situation in Sudan with our African colleagues, who are also divided on this, but prioritize it in our relationship with the United Arab Emirates and Egypt, what are we talking about? We can take about a peace fund or the African Union or the European Union. We have to start to make this a political thing. Let's not close ourselves inside the African Union and the European Union. Use these 2 gigantic organizations, but politicize them. make sure that we have groups of allied, of progressives. Let me say this is also a conference. I'm saying that as the president of the Max van der Stoel Foundation. It's not only the relationship between African states and European states. It's how do we bind together progressive forces? I'm very afraid of autocratic governments in Europe working together with autocratic governments in Africa and doing exactly the same that they've done for many, many years. The third part, and I close with that because I'm sure we'll discuss it further, and I thank FEPS very well, where I'm able now with Anne and others to play a role in that. It's a great group of think tanks, marvelous report. It's about the reality of the third transition. Namely, how do you combine saving the climate, the Green Deal in Europe, by making sure we don't do it at the cost of Africa, where there is a tension between development and ecology, if we like it or not. There is not sufficient climate finance. We have, I think, Jorrit, you know always the figures, how many sun things we have in Europe. I say in the Netherlands, I think we have more than in all over Africa. Now, climate finance is being reduced as we speak in Belém. I mean, in real terms. We'll see what happens. But the real point is another one, is can we combine green industrialization in Africa, according to the wishes of the job creation, the electrification, the value added, adding assets, to the interests of Europe, which is actually weak in this area when it comes, yes, to rare materials. And that's my last point. It actually creates, if you see, and maybe now I'm a bit naive, I'll see what the African colleagues see. But although we are still a lot richer than many African countries, things are changing. Possibilities are changing. Countries are hedging. We are relatively weaker, not weak, and you are relatively stronger, but not strong. Maybe that creates a possibility for a more honest conversation. I always come to Africa and say, yes, the Chinese, at least they're honest. They're transactional, and transactional, we like that well, but they say what they want. The Europeans come with I don't know how many criteria, good wishes that we as progressive all support, human rights, very important. But in fact, you don't do it. And I think maybe this real conversation between Africa and Europe should be around not pragmatism, not transactionalism, but understand that we have also common interest in the multilateral system, in a green economy, in taking development serious and thinking about what we're faced with in a world where might is right, where international law goes down the drain in a few months, and where the double standards are there. That's, I think, the task of progressives in Africa, in Europe, to reformulate. And I think there are potentialities. We have a summit next month. There is the G20, but they have to be politicized for it.
You've put a lot on the table, which is wonderful. This is great because it helps us kind of get a conversation going. I wonder what my African colleagues on the panel think about whether or not some of the issues you've put on the table, like the green transition, climate change, migration, both of you have hit on that point. I'm curious from Joel, and then I'll come to Chris. Do you see the Africa-EU partnership from that perspective? Why is it important from an African perspective to partner with the EU? What would be your response to that?
Yeah, if one were to respond to the question why Africa should partner with Europe, I would agree with what the colleagues have said in the main, but elaborate perhaps by starting at a higher level of abstraction to say that the starting point in any genuine partnership is the commonality or intersection of values, visions, and interests. And there are many attributes that Africa shares with Europe. And at the core of this is the improvement of the human condition of our peoples on both continents. Various generations of human rights, economic, social, political, and otherwise, and they are found in the charters of both the AU and the EU. One can refer to many visions in Africa, Agenda 2063, and so on and so forth. And the immediate interests of Africa to increase levels of investments, to enhance application of new technologies, to improve access to markets. I hope we'll come back to that discussion later. And also to resolve the debt burden that faces many African countries. And so I would argue that to the extent that Europe shares that vision of Africa and the programs that it is trying to implement, then the relationship will come naturally. It does not need to be forced. And amongst the issues that also need to be addressed would be matters of tariff and non-tariff barriers. And further, reference is usually made to our common history, but is the kind of history that is littered with the shame of slavery, colonialism, and even neo-colonial attempts to turn Africa into vassal states. But inversely, that terrible experience can be turned into an opportunity to facilitate Africa's development. Beyond that, I think Africa has got much to offer Europe. In the creativity of its young population, in the large reserves of critical minerals that has been referred to, in the vast stretches of arable land that is lying fallow. And so Africa should relate to Europe because it has got something to offer Europe. And inversely, Europe should relate to Africa on that basis. Now, to come to conclusion, the question has been posed, should that relationship between Africa and Europe be an exclusive marital bond? Just Africa and Europe to the exclusion of everyone else? My answer is, of course not. African countries have got the right to pursue relations with countries in Asia, including China, in the Middle East, in the Americas, and so on, and to do so weighing the strategic interests of Africa and the pros and cons in those relationships. And any of these partners, including Europe, will be able to establish and pursue enduring relations if it is seen to act as a reliable partner, fully appreciate, to come back to what I was saying earlier, fully appreciative of Africa's immediate endeavors and Africa's strategic interests. I should conclude maybe by referring to the issue of security that has been mentioned. The genesis of those challenges are many. Just to give an example, to encourage genuine and frank discourse on these matters, what is happening in the Sahel has got its origin in how Europe and North America, particularly the United States, conducted themselves in relation to Libya and created instability that today is difficult to manage. And so we should also learn from that kind of history. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would like to pick one point before I transition to Chris, which is the point around Africa needing to engage with multiple partners. It's the point made over conversations yesterday that Africa is really at a critical point where it can set the terms of how it engages with other actors, and it is up to it to kind of set the stage for what those relationships look like based on what is most advantageous for it. Chris, I'll turn over to you. Why should Africa partner with Europe? What are some of those points that you would highlight or build on?
I think when you look at the state of, I like to use demographics to frame my discussions of the continent, because when you look at trends, development in terms of the growth of cities in particular, Africa is at the forefront of it. You know, I live in Lagos, Nigeria, which has been projected by 2100 to be the most populous city in the world. You look at other cities like Johannesburg, Kinshasa, Nairobi, Cairo. These are among the fastest growing places in the world, Dar es Salaam and the likes. Europe is in a place of demographic crisis where the population is aging, even though European cities are countries are relatively wealthy, but they have challenges in terms of making the demographics match their politics as well as the economics. Whereas Africa is in the reverse situation. Many countries in West Africa where I live, the median age is like 18, right? So there tends to be a perspective in Europe that Africa is our natural partner. I hear this at conferences, I read this in white papers, I hear it, all over the place at, EU, AU summits, Africa, it's a natural partnership, partner of choice. And many young people simply don't see the world that way. Many young people, for instance, my younger relatives who are in their 20s or even teens have not come up in a world where Great Britain, because Great Britain was the colonial ruler of Nigeria, was such a prominent actor in their lives, right? Many of my relatives in other parts of West Africa have come up in a context where France was no longer the partner of choice. They've come up in a world where the Chinese, the Emiratis, the Saudis are all doing, remarkable things in terms of growing their footprint on the continent. But at the political level in both, our capitals as well as European capitals, there seems to be conversations that take place as though this is 1965, right? Where Europe and Africa are like this, whereas Europe at this point is one of several partners. And we've seen governments in Europe and the EU collectively try to instrumentalize this, where, for instance, in the Ukraine-Russia war, where the EU and the United States essentially try to compel African states to take their side in terms of taking a hard line against the Russian invasion. And it's all worth clarifying that African nations did, in fact, make clear that, listen, we've been on the receiving end of territorial expansion and all of these things. Our position could not be more clear. However, when it comes to weaponizing the international system, sanctions and things of the like, I like to refer to the fact that, for instance, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, it's a body in the US Treasury Department. When you look at the number of countries that are among the most sanctioned, African countries are the single largest of any geographic region. So African countries understood these things and what that means in terms of economic growth. I lived in Nigeria in the 90s when we had the Abacha regime, for instance. I knew how sanctions, for instance, it's not just about regimes. It's about you can't print your own currency, you can't buy medication, you can't send money or receive money through Western Union and things like that. So that reticence came from our historical experience, but no one wanted to listen to that. It was all about the geopolitical pressures and fissures of competition. So all of these realities have pulled Africa and Europe apart in ways that I don't often see recognition or cognizance of. So, however, I do also think that the historical bonds between Africa and Europe, when you look at the large African diaspora in European countries, including the Netherlands, when you look at the fact that despite everything I've said, that African nations, African peoples still look to European countries, European cities, European cultural trends, developments as worth emulating. African countries generally still think, there are lots of things to be learned from European countries, whether it's in terms of economic development, whether it's in terms of technological innovation. African countries and African people still see a reason to regard the European Union and Europeans collectively as a people, because I like to emphasize that, people-to-people relations are just as, if not more important than bilateral, multilateral, or plurilateral state relations. However, we must recognize that we live in a world where lots of, powers across the world, lots of rising powers as well as established ones, have the wherewithal and the freedom to be able to pick who they associate with. We must move away from this instrumentalization of geopolitical association. We've seen this over several decades. We continue to see this, for instance, in Niger, when the Nigerians had the coup and the Americans came in and essentially tried to dictate, with the, I would say, complicity of the European partners as well, who the Nigerians should be associating with. There was this very famous, famous in Niger article in the Washington Post that the Prime Minister complained about the fact that the then U.S. ambassador came into, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State came in with the knowledge of the Europeans into Niger, uninvited, by the way, and essentially gave the Nigerians a long lecture about the fact that, we hear you're talking to the Russians, you're doing this, you're doing that, and you should desist from doing that. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're trying to have a negotiation or a discussion with, someone that you are at loggerheads with, I don't think lecturing them is the way to go. We've seen this with European partners as well, and I think that we should try to move away from, patterns of behaviors like that and look at the fact that Africa and Europe have geographic proximity in common. We have lots of enthusiasm about one another's development. We have lots in common in terms of values as well. African nations, overwhelmingly, when you look at Afrobarometer surveys and things of that nature, support multi-party democracy. Despite what people say in Mali, Niger, most Africans do not support, when you look at the data anyway, military rule. We support multi-party rule. We support good institutions. We support accountability and transparency in government. These are all easy ways that African people and African states can draw one another closer in spite of the differences. So that would be my answer to why Africa and Europe should work together.
This is really excellent, Chris. I think the key point, you've put a lot on the table, as everyone has. I think the key point is that partnership cannot be assumed or taken for granted, right? You don't just assume that because of proximity, then therefore there's a relationship between Africa and Europe. How do you kind of build that? How do you develop this partnership? I think is a really, really critical point. I would like to pick up from some of what you've laid on the table. We've talked earlier about security, migration. Bert, I would like to turn over to you. I think you also put on the table debt and debt relief more specifically. I'm curious, from all of these topics that we have as far as EU-Africa relations are concerned, which are the levers, which are the dimensions of EU-Africa relations that you think have the greatest potential to make the relationship between EU and Africa a bit more equitable? What are those areas where asymmetries could be reduced the most, if you have a perspective on that?
Let me start by saying the real issues are actually, I very much agree with what our Nigerian colleague has just said. It's under all of this. So you cannot just take European-African relationship and say, with a few leverages and a few measures, I can make a lot for you. And I think we all would agree around debt relief, not a new kind of green protectionism. Think about transitions. How do you deal with job creation in Africa? How do we make sure that we actually don't divide and rule? How do you make sure that it's not an extractive relationship, but one which is actually more equal? But the key is, I think, what has been said about what threatens us. To think, I agree, the fact that we are all working in a world that is very polarized and fragmented, so we don't have a unique relationships. I think that's positive for the Europeans to learn. I think this is what you're basically saying is, come back to the reality. You're only a smaller partner. You're not necessarily the privileged ones, so we maybe have a different way of talking to each other, which I think is positive. That creates a possibility for both sides, if you wish. And I think that's very important. The second is on having in-depth a discussion, and I come to your point, or is around this issue of democracy and human rights, which also we have to think through what that means in the present day, in which has been to a certain extent weaponized also by us. I remember sitting as foreign minister with the Burundian delegation, basically we were imposing on them this and this and that. It didn't mean there was not a real point. There is a real point in our societies, in your societies, around corruption, big man politics. How do you deal with it? And that's a more difficult one. It's an undercurrent which we better openly discuss. We see autocratic tendencies in Europe right now, similar issues in Africa. It's not so easy to deal with that on one leverage. That's why I really honor this meeting today, that we talk about people who are not necessarily thinking as being enclosed in a country or continent, although we are parts of different identities, but thinking through how that works in these days. I would tend to think about, since I've worked many years in Mali and Ivory Coast, to agree with what you're saying. It was not democracy which was the key. It was the lack of delivery of democracy, which is a big risk in Europe and in Africa in very different ways. I would think we stimulate there much more of a common discussion. For us, let's be a very open question, for instance, on the relationship with Gen Z. I was very impressed, somebody said that yesterday in a debate. The problem in many, and it's similar but different in Europe, is what is more important in this case, for instance, for the Kenyan government? I don't know who mentioned it yesterday. Is it accountability what they're afraid of? They're more afraid for accountability than for the fact that they can easily, repress a rebellion. And Gen Z has a completely new way of thinking through, think about the Arab Spring and so on. So we have to think through about these things as well. I think the undercurrents are more important than that. Doesn't mean that there are not an agenda. I would think maybe very quickly where you would prioritize. Today we have Belém, we have COP, we have an African position which I think is extremely strong. We have a European position which has unfortunately been weakened, but is still rather progressive when you compare it to some others. We have a historical responsibility. I do not see yet our governments, catch up to that in terms of the enormous short-term problems of capital shortage in Africa. We have still a capital outflow out of Africa. The reduction of development aid is very serious at the short term, but it can lead to a new model of cooperation. But we still need it in very many places, not in the old-fashioned way, but around the issues in many fragile states. And that's a cooperation we have to think through as well. My problem is on the short term also with the fact that Europe correctly, in its relations with all our partners, see that all these relations are weaponized, as we've weaponized them between us. And if you look at the Draghi report, making the European, that's what's happening in Europe right now. And I think it's not incorrect, by the way. We need a strong economy, we need jobs, we need technology, as Africa does, in a different way, but equally important, if not more important, in view of the inequality that exists between us. Let's make sure immediately, what I would say to our European colleagues, that strategy of strategic autonomy, which is not necessarily wrong. I think we should keep some interdependence as well, but become dependent on each other in an unequal way. Same for Africa. That we don't do this in a way that goes at the cost of other continents. So start immediately thinking about the CBAM. I'm in favor of that. Everybody knows, I'm sure that's a tariff for good reasons. Namely, if you want to produce green here, then it's better that the costs are not easily imported from others. And so you have a leverage. What does it mean at the moment for work and jobs and a young generation with nickel in Zambia and steel in Mozambique? It's disastrous. So if we don't immediately take measures around this, and not only talk summits, but say these are the 4 things we have to agree on very quickly, it's not going to happen. So it's around capital outflow, risk, private investment that creates jobs. We know that agenda. It's not happening, at least not sufficiently. The same goes for protectionism. And certainly, I should have started with it, but I'm worried about it. It doesn't happen. We are not in a Bretton Woods moment. I don't see real changes in voting behavior in the Security Council and in the IMF and the World Bank. It's absolutely key. It can only be done politically by getting together forces who want that. It won't come automatically at the moment from Europe, I'm afraid. I think it's wrong. It's at the detriment of Africa, but it's also at the detriment of Europe, because at the moment you don't make it a legitimate organization, it won't function. Look at the United Nations.
Right. There's a lot of constraints, it sounds, from what the EU is needing to navigate, what the multilateral system under the UN needs to navigate to ensure that there's debt reduction for Africa to be able to pursue a lot of different economic opportunities. Joel, I would like to turn over to you from your perspective. Let's zoom in a bit on the AU more specifically, and because Africa could mean, bilateral relations, where I'm really interested in hearing what the EU, what the African Union has done differently, what it needs to be doing differently to ensure that it's able to meet international partners when it comes to some of these collaboration issues that have been put on the table.
What the AU needs to do differently?
Yes, the AU.
Okay. Maybe the starting point, and it relates to issues that have been raised by the other colleagues, is that when we judge Africa's current situation, its immediate interests and its long-term objectives, it may be useful, particularly for the EU, to proceed from an understanding of where Africa stands on fundamental issues to do with its own development and its own, the condition of its own people. It's one thing, as has been said, to try and lecture to African countries about what they need to do. It's another to use the statutes that Africa already has, statutes that Africa has collectively adopted. Vision 2063, the Charter on Human and People's Rights, which includes gender rights, African mining vision, and so on and so forth. And in that context, say to Africa collectively and variously, how can we partner in order to assist you to attain your own objectives? Not that as Europe, we are coming with a lecture and a template on what needs to be done. There are challenges in the sense that some of these agreements and visions and statutes are observed in the breach by many countries on the continent, but Europe can partner with Africa in the context of the African peer review mechanism. How can we strengthen it so that Africa itself can develop the, I would say, the capacity, the courage, and the principled approach to correct its own countries that breach what are otherwise collective positions of Africa. So Europe should relate to Africa on these issues on the basis of what Africa has decided upon. I think maybe another major issue that we need to think about relates to the immediate questions that are today under discussion. And maybe I'll just mention one to respect time. Given the dynamics that are happening across the Atlantic, the question confronts all unions, EU, AU, individual countries, whether we just fold up and relent, or whether, especially as progressives in Africa and in Europe, we should be seen to be standing up to some of the terrible things that are happening. You would know how South Africa is characterized across the Atlantic, bad things happening in South Africa, it is said. And what one sees missing, in addition to what is now being said about Nigeria, what one sees missing, it's solidarity and campaigns in Europe and in Africa in order to support one another to protect not only sovereignty, not only the right to development, but also to protect all of us from what I would characterize as an impulse that reflects, from a person who comes from South Africa, it's a triggering issue, an impulse that suggests the emergence of white supremacist ideologies and approaches, even amongst the most powerful.
Thank you so much. I'll pick up from your point around some of these normative frameworks from Europe may not be endogenous to Africa, and therefore, how do we kind of work with some of the principles and frameworks that already exist on the continent. I would like to turn over to Anne, given your work and leadership within FEPS, but also your focus specifically on the on the Feminist Foreign Policy Progressive Voices Collective. I'm curious, how do you advocate for gender equality, which is one of those norms that are, at least on paper, on the continent? How do you advocate for the inclusion of the perspectives of women in the work that you do?
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm co-chair of the FEPS Feminist Foreign Policy Progressive Voices Collective, which is a network of about 60 politicians and academians and women organizations. And we consistently push for more gender equality, feminism in relation to the global south. What we can see now is that in Europe there is several governments with a feminist foreign policy, but it's Latin America who's taking the lead. I mean, it's Colombia, it's Mexico, it was Argentina before the motor, the man, you know, with a saw, yeah. But there are fewer in Africa. We have Liberia, we have Morocco, actually. And it's needed to be more discussed in Africa. What we did in Pretoria in June, where there were a very, very good T20 meeting, that's the parallel to G20, is the think tank part of G20, and South Africa has, really been active in that, was to see how could we get the gender equality and also the feminism into the heart where it belongs, and that is the economic agenda, because that would also be interesting for African countries. And we need to say that gender equality is not a socialist issue. It's actually also a macroeconomic issue. And we try to discuss how can we put issues that is interesting also for African governments, kind of getting it into the discussion. And one thing and that's what we did as pursuing a feminist foreign policy for 8 years, is to always make a gender impact assessment on how fiscal policy, how austerity cuts that is often demanded by the IMF or the World Bank is disproportionately affect women, because women in many African countries are doing the unpaid work, the care work, the informal sector work, and that is not taken into account. And you need to be very formal about it, you need to be very systematic about it. When I was Minister of Trade, we saw that trade agreements often is very, very gender blind. So together with UNCTAD, that is the United Nations Organization for Trade and Development, we developed a toolbox for gender analysis for trade negotiators. Don't read it. It's because it really is for negotiators. So no, it's not a pamphlet. It's a toolbox, and that is also something when we talk about the global gateway. What are we going to support Africa with? We cannot do that, I think, in a progressive and in a fair way if we don't put on the gender glasses, because then it will be even deepening the unfairness towards women and girls in the African countries. So I think this is much more important than people think. They think, okay, gender equality, plop, that's an ad hoc thing that we don't have to put into when we discuss the real issues of green transition or critical minerals or the austerity measures. It's not. But if we don't have it, systematically in everything that we do, it will be forgotten. And in this case, it will be African women who are paying the price.
Thank you. I should do a time check. My apologies that I am doing a terrible job. I have one question for Chris. I would appreciate if you would give me 10 minutes after our hour for questions. Chris, if I could ask you to be very brief. I know from your work you believe in multilateralism. I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think the EU needs to be? What does this particular moment mean for the EU? We know that there is quite a change coming, and some would say it's already here, the change in foreign aid. There's a lot of conversations about this is a moment for Africa to kind of take ownership and take responsibility for some of the changes that are coming about because of this global reordering. What are some of the key policy and governance issues that you think warrant the attention of the African Union?
So I think I like to start from the Summit of the Future last year. One of the key reasons why we had a breakthrough was remarkably because of Uganda, which was part of the negotiations, as well as Namibia and Germany. They all worked as a sort of triad to try to smooth divisions between, let's say, Russia was one of the parties that was sort of against a number of resolutions that had been agreed to. And I say that to refer to the ways in which African states like the A3 on the UN Security Council, for instance, have often played a very important role in brokering sort of mediations of disputes and sort of disagreements between typically the Western alliance and China and Russia. It's very interesting how African states are unable to do this in the African Union. We've all talked about Sudan, we've talked about Ethiopia, Libya, Mali, so many other conflicts, and how all of that relates to the development aid, for instance, as you've mentioned, how African states can exert so much energy in the multilateral and global forum, but when it comes to the home front, we're a bit more reticent or even willing to defer to donors, for instance. You know, I talk about the fact that something like 70% of the African Union's annual budget is funded by donors, how organizations like GIZ have something like 140 different people working with the AU on a range of issues, and how African states and their rhetoric of autonomy and all of these things, there's a mismatch between the reality of their behaviors. However, we are seeing some states step up to the forefront, like in Nigeria, for instance, where after the Trump administration announced the aid cuts, the Ministry of Health announced that it would absorb about 30,000 health workers into the Ministry of Health in a variety of roles. Some would be permanent staff, some would be ad hoc. We've also seen Ghana, we've seen Liberia take steps to absorb some of the fallout of the aid cuts. In a country like Liberia, they lost actually all of their US aid, quite literally 100%. So, you know, everyone predicted the sky would fall out, and in some ways there have been, I'm not trying to say there aren't challenges of any way, but we're used to thinking of Africa and African states as takers of multilateralism and sort of passerbyers and observers, but we often discount the ways in which African states rise up to the occasion. This is one of them. I remember in 2020, when the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust was created, African states tried to acquire vaccines across the international market, but you know, the vaccine nationalism of the global North states prevented them from being able to do much better on that front. So I want to be clear that, you know, there isn't a single story about African multilateralism, African agency, Africa's opportunity to be entrepreneurial in the ways in which they can respond to crises. They are failing in many instances. I've listed some of them, but they are also succeeding. They are uneven in other parts. So we should try to look at the ways in which Africa is already doing a number of things right, where they can learn from, who they can partner with, because sometimes alliances will be on issues, sometimes they will be on topics, sometimes they will be in scenarios. I think we should allow the flexibility of African state institutions like the African Development Bank, the AU, and the likes to come through as needed.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I would like to open it to questions. My apologies again that I did not allot as much time to conversations and questions from you. I think I see a hand over here. A hand over here, and then a hand right there. So we'll take 2 questions at a time, and then we'll assess where we are with time.
My name is Henk Holtslag from Meta Wageningen. I have a question for Mr. Koenders. You mentioned migration and job creation as a very critical topic. Now, we as the Netherlands, we are champions in water and agriculture. And we have worked for 30 years in Africa, and we see that in one country there's developments that can reduce the cost of irrigation and water. But it's completely unknown in other countries. So should we as Netherlands, or maybe even Europe, not invest much more in the South-South exchange of good and best practices?
Thank you. And we'll take the second question right there. If you could be brief, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bert and Linde. I have a question for the two of you. So I'm ambassador for Bobi Wine. He's the democratic opposition leader in Uganda. And your ministers are constantly meeting representatives of the dictatorship. But I've been talking to your present colleagues. They never wanted to meet Bobi Wine. But in Belarus, you do meet with the democratic opposition leader.
Could you kindly ask your
My question is, why do you refuse to meet with democratic opposition leaders in Africa? Because that is not a support of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn it over. Question on migration and agriculture, and then the question on meeting with African leaders.
Look, let me just support what is being said. I think when we look to cooperation between countries, it should already for a long time been outside of the simple North-South relationship when it comes to technical cooperation, water management, the issue of agriculture and agricultural transformation and all these kind of things which are crucial, I think, for all of us. I don't know if we are still the champions on it. I hope we are. And I think still there is a lot of knowledge which is at the moment being destroyed, in my view, because whatever, I've been a Minister for International Development, and I know what was wrong in our own paradigms on this. I think we discussed that, sort of the traditional one. But there was also an enormous amount of interesting cooperation at the level of peoples, of experts, and especially in the two areas you're mentioning. And Wageningen is an excellent university. The best diaspora we have around the world is working together on issues that are very practical for citizens and for people. I agree very much with what we're saying. The whole issue of making that also not locked into a relationship that is bilateral between two continents is absolutely key. I think when in another capacity, I'm working with the Advisory Council for the Dutch government on especially this issue of what is our real cooperation and engagement, not only when it comes to Russia, but to broad things in the global South. It's especially this South-South cooperation. Sometimes you can do it with, the knowledge we have with somebody in Bangladesh, where there's an enormous amount of, interest and capacity, with some of the key countries in Africa. So I can only support that. Let's not throw away what was actually good and make it emancipated to a new world. Disorder, I'm afraid, but at least relationship in which South-South cooperation is. And also invest in this. I mean, it's not only that, if we're all out of this traditional paradigm, let's look at the enormous capacity. I think even in traditional organizations, I am afraid to say traditional, because they should be innovative, and I'm glad it was the platform last year for the UN. But it's a great South-South cooperation within the UN system. Why don't we support it around the issues that we are something maybe to contribute to it, not to all issues, but especially to water and agriculture. On this one, I can only agree. It's not, this is something that is also very political, to be very honest. Look, I remember very well my time to meet with the president of Uganda. I don't know for how many years. He's still there, 1986. It's not for me as the Dutch to say that he should leave, but if we cooperate since 1986, and the only thing the Dutch government do is go there to make a migration deal, which is absolutely out of any sense of reality, because Uganda has already many refugees. And there is a situation that's very hard. Let's start by saying to our own government, don't get into that silly business, and make sure that you talk to everybody. And that we talk to everybody, including the opposition in Uganda. So I can only strongly agree with this. And of course, when you go officially there, it's not always easy. I remember that too. When you're in a formal position, you go to the opposition. Not everybody likes that. We didn't like either that the vice president of the United States. We didn't. It's the only meeting we haven't mentioned Trump yet. Eh? You were very good in getting around it. But his meeting was the AfD in Germany. But Bobby Wine is not the AfD in Uganda. So let's make sure that we do this kind of stuff. This allies Africans and Europeans, Democrats, I think, together. And I'm very impressed what's happening with the Gen Z, who already has it very difficult in many countries. Let's see where we, as citizens of the world, can support them.
Oh, great. Let's take a couple. We have time for a couple more questions, and maybe the rest of our panelists could respond to those. Right there.
I fear we have to close things off, as I understood.
Oh, okay, we have to conclude. Okay. Thank you all very much. My apologies for running tight on time. They'll be around for a few minutes, so feel free to come up and ask any questions you have. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.